Welcome to Library Out Loud, a conversation about any and all things related to the Spokane County Library District. Library Out Loud is brought to you by the Spokane County Library District and our friends at STCU. Now, here's your host, Jane Baker.
Hello and welcome to Library Out Loud. I'm Jane Baker, the Communication and Development Director for the Spokane County Library District. Joining me today is Adam Boyd. Hello, Adam.
Hi, Jane. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming down.
Absolutely.
Adam, you have a fascinating subject for us to talk about today. You are the brewer at the Iron Goat Brewing Company, host of Good Brews Radio, and the president of the Inland Brewers United Homebrew Club, among many other things.
That's correct, yeah.
You're a busy guy.
I wear all those hats, yeah.
And very well. So we're going to be talking about the science and history of beer.
Yeah.
And first of all, I have to ask you the cliche question. Did you bring samples?
I did not. I'm sorry.
Darn. A little too early in the morning. That's okay. I had to get that one out. I'm sure you're asked that quite a bit. Right?
I am. And normally I try to oblige, but...
That's great. Well, thank you again for being here today.
Yeah.
I like beer.
Oh, good.
I'm a wonderful consumer of beer.
Good.
But I really know a little about how
Sure.
it's about beer.
Yeah.
So this should be a fascinating discussion today.
Yeah.
First of all, we have you on, not only because you're an awesome person who has a lot of great things to talk about, but you're doing a program.
That's correct, yeah.
At the library, at several of our libraries, on the science and history of craft beer.
Yeah.
So whatever we talk about today, if anybody out there wants to know more, make sure to attend one of these classes. So,
Please, yeah.
We'll talk more about how to find out when and where the classes are. But right now, tell me, how'd you get into this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I could say there was some magical moment where I suddenly just fell into beer, but it was kind of just an odd way of finding it. Unlike maybe some of my peers, I didn't necessarily just immediately jump into craft beer and appreciating beer. I drank a lot of bad beer early on. I first started getting into beer in college, and it was just an element of the socializing that you do in college, and never really paid attention to what I was drinking or where it came from, or even gave one thought to how it was made. And it just kind of happened throughout the years. I have one of those personalities where I start to learn a little bit about something and I have to learn everything about it.
Okay.
And so I was given a craft beer at one point at perhaps a party or something, and it tasted unlike anything else I'd ever had before. Mm-hmm. And it kind of hooked me, and I had to know more about the beer. I had to know more about where it came from, who brewed it, and that just sort of led me along the path of grabbing every beer book I could, finally getting into the hobby of making beer myself, and finally I just I wanted to be an expert in beer and devoted a lot of my time to it. So
wow, that's probably a goal of a lot of people to be an expert in beer. I'm going to pick up, and like I said, I enjoy beer, but I don't know a lot about it. So I'm going to pick up on some words you said.
Sure.
Craft beer.
Yeah.
What makes it craft beer different than any other beer?
It's a good question, and it's actually becoming a more poignant question these days because craft beer is essentially loosely defined right now as beer that's being produced by breweries throughout the country or even the world that are independently owned and generally are small in terms of scale to other beer brewers. Everyone's probably familiar with American craft beer lagers. They take over our Super Bowl commercials.
Sure.
And they are light yellow fizzy water that typically is marketed to be a drinkable beer because it has little flavor and is refreshing and hydrating.
Okay.
Craft beer kind of aims to create beer that does have flavor and maybe explore beer styles that haven't been popular for decades.
Okay.
So craft beer is really about the sort of independent movement of craft breweries that are independently owned or family owned and are trying to make beer that kind of relates to the communities they're within.
Okay, so it's more limited. Like you can go to the grocery store and get those other kind of beers anytime.
Sure, yeah.
Right? And readily available. So if you find a craft beer that you like, it it's more limited to?
Possibly,
Okay.
yeah. And I think that's one big push within the craft beer community is also drinking local. That people are starting to find that new breweries are opening up in their neighborhoods or in their
Sure.
local cities and trying to support local rather than some of those other larger, we call them macro breweries, that are absolutely, so a lot of the beer might be brewed in the United States, but the companies who own these breweries own 400 other companies across the globe and are usually located outside of the United States. So in terms of connecting with the product and the brand, you're really just buying a very globalized product that really doesn't have a local identity, whereas craft beer really tries to look at the community around it and incorporate that into their beer.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So when we start talking about history, or when you talk about
Sure.
history and
Yeah.
the program, how far back in history do you go?
We start at kind of where at least historians believe beer began, which is all the way back into the ancient Egypt and Mesopotamian era. And there's even new studies that might say that China was also brewing beer around the same time. So,
Really?
yeah, beer became a very important part of culture right around the time that human beings were starting to cultivate grain and do agriculture.
Sure.
Baking bread was just as important as making beer, and the two were very closely tied together in terms of a
Bread and beer.
process.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
we kind of go from beer's origins all the way up to today, where we're sort of experiencing what I call the craft beer boom. We're really starting to see the idea of breweries opening up all across the country. Just last year in the United States, we finally had more breweries up in operation than we had before Prohibition in the 1920s. So we finally
Wow.
got back to where we were
Wow.
over a century ago.
So was that part of it before Prohibition? Was there more of the local craft beers then?
There certainly was, and there were a
Sure.
lot more breweries. We had over 1,000 breweries in the United States before Prohibition. And then once Prohibition hit, unfortunately, many of those breweries ended up going out of business.
Sure.
The larger ones ended up surviving because they were able to experiment in other areas. Some breweries ended up making ceramics or ice cream or all kinds of things that you wouldn't normally
my
relate to
goodness.
beer. But that was their way of sort of staying in business and staying in operation during a period of time where they couldn't produce alcohol.
Sure.
And then, of course, once Prohibition was repealed, those breweries still in operation went back to doing what they knew, which was making beer.
Making beer. That's great.
Yeah.
And then did it become more of those bigger, what you call the macro breweries, or were they the ones that kind of took over then?
They were, and in
Okay.
fact, one of the big factors that helped push that was actually World War II.
Really?
There was some sort of rationing of a lot of the supplies that were being made in the United States, including grain.
Oh, sure.
So a lot of those breweries were finding restrictions in producing beer, which is when they ended up turning to what we call adjuncts, elements that add sugar to beer that aren't necessarily grain or barley. So things like rice or corn that are sort of characteristic to light lagers that we might see Super Bowl commercials for.
Oh.
And so they don't add a lot of flavor or character to the beer, but they create the alcohol that is quintessential for beer.
Okay.
So that sort of became the yellow fizzy water that we know of.
Sure.
And then actually there was a lot of studies that pushed the government to help support beer production by saying that the yeast in beer provided vitamin B, which would be vital for soldiers on the war front or factory workers helping the war effort.
Okay.
So actually there were a lot of government contracts for some of these breweries to actually have a certain amount of beer allotted for soldiers serving in World War II, which helped those breweries grow
Sure.
and become the mass conglomerate breweries they are today. So,
Wow,
yeah.
wow! You really have done a lot of homework. Sounds like it would be a fascinating program to
Yeah.
hear all the history. Then, so without giving away any recipe secrets, I
Sure,
don't know,
no
I'm
spoilers.
Kind of thinking it's like KFC, where it's
Right.
a secret recipe. So generally, what's in beer?
Yeah, it's a good question. Beer is really just made up of 4 ingredients. Water, which is the largest ingredient. In fact, 90% of beer in its weight is water.
Okay.
So it's hydrating.
Sure.
If you're hot, have a beer.
That's why a cold beer on a
That's
hot
right,
day is
absolutely.
perfect. Yeah.
Along with that, there's some sort of sugar source, which is typically rooted in starches, typically malted grains of some sort.
Okay.
Mostly barley, but you could also have things like oats, rye, as I mentioned before, rice or corn. So some sort of starch source. And then we have hops, which are adopted as one of the most common elements to flavor beer.
Okay.
And it also provides other aspects to the beer like bitterness. And there's even a preservation element to hops. They're antibacterial by nature.
Sure.
And then finally, yeast. Yeast are the unsung heroes of beer. They do all the magical work to ferment the beer and create the flavors we know, the bubbles that we enjoy in carbonation, and then, of course, the alcohol that is the just added bonus to beer as well. So.
Added bonus. So what makes a beer dark and what makes it light?
Yeah, mainly looking at like the different colors of beer, a lot of that comes from the grains that are used in the recipe.
Okay.
A lot of malted barley gets kilned, so it actually gets toasted within a heat source. So you can have anything from a very light colored grain that attributes a light color to the beer, all the way to a very heavily roasted grain, which would be like roasted barley. It's very dark. It gives flavor and smells like coffee or chocolate, and they would be in things like stouts that we're familiar with. If we know any, an Irish stout, that would be the color and flavors that we're getting are mainly attributed to the highly roasted grains that are within it.
Grains.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's this is a spectacular topic. So there's some science involved.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
It's a very science-heavy industry. Yeah, for sure.
Really?
Yeah.
Really. And is all that in part of the toasting and the measuring and is there a certain way it all goes together, or do you just dump it all in?
There is definitely a method of how beer is made. You typically start with the grains themselves. You add water and create what's called a mash, which is essentially it's like oatmeal. It's like a big oatmeal pot. Most breweries have a mash tun that holds just hundreds of pounds of grain with hot water, and we let that steep. That initiates the process that starts to unlock the sugars within the grain that the yeast are going to need later to make the beer. Then that water's drained off the grain. We call it wort. It's basically beer before it's fermented.
Okay.
And then we boil it, which does a number of different things. It sanitizes the wort, kills any weird bugs or bacteria that might be in it.
That's a good thing.
It can create some other flavors that come from caramelization, so maybe some darker flavors like toffee or caramel notes. And then it also is where we add the hops. And by boiling the hops, that's what adds the bitterness to the beer that we typically are familiar with. And without that bitterness, beer would be a very sweet, sticky beverage that probably only soda drinkers and children would enjoy.
Okay.
So the hops add that balance, and they also add other elements of flavor and aroma as well. Once it's boiled, then it's cooled down, it's put into a tank, and that's where we introduce our hardworking fellows, the yeast, and they do their work. They consume the sugars within the beer, and they turn it into alcohol and CO2 and create the flavors that we're familiar with. And after that, it's chilled, it's filtered, it's packaged, and you drink it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And generally, how long does that process take?
For a typical ale, you're probably looking at somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks from the time it's brewed to the time it's actually pouring into your glass and you're enjoying it.
2 to 4 weeks.
Yeah,
Wow.
there are other beers, lager beers, that might take longer. They sort of sit for a long time at cold temperatures to develop the flavors that they're familiar with. So that process might be 8 to 12 weeks before that beer is
Oh, my
consumed.
goodness.
So,
wow.
yeah.
Wow. That's very exciting. Well, we're going to talk more about this, the science and history of craft beer. Guest is Adam Boyd, and he starts with these classes actually tonight at the North Spokane Library. We'll talk more about when and where you can get more information and more with Adam right after we take a break on Library Out Loud.
Is your child having trouble coping with a personal disability, but don't know where to go? Consider our friends at Breakthrough Incorporated. Breakthrough takes great pride in mentoring their DDA clients who have intellectual disabilities and their BRS clients who have challenging behaviors toward the creation of safe, appropriate, ethically sound life goals. They integrate programs at school and home to enrich their lives. They work hard to make a positive difference in you and your family's lives. Breakthrough provides a highly structured, fully staffed residential setting in local neighborhoods, 6 in Spokane and 2 in the Tri-Cities. Diagnoses affect people differently, so their service to each resident is unique, giving them the opportunity to grow and evolve. For more information on Breakthrough, visit their website at breakthroughincorporated.org.
Hi, this is Kurt Stockwell with Well Dressed Walrus. We are a local website design and development company here in Spokane. What we do is build beautiful, usable websites for local businesses. A website needs to be beautiful, it needs to be usable for your users, your customers, and yourself. Contact us anytime. We'd love to talk with you about your online marketing.
What? You haven't been to the library lately? Stop in today and see that the library is more than books. Spokane County Library District facilities feature on-site technology, including Wi-Fi, computers, and printers, as well as free use of meeting rooms. The Library District offers events and programs for all ages, from story times to career development and employer classes to Social Security workshops. Our staff is well trained and happy to help. Find out more about your library at scld.org.
Hello and welcome back to Library Out Loud. I'm Jane Baker, and guest today on the program is Adam Boyd, a brewer. I don't want to say a home brewer because that's your job.
I do it as a job and as a hobby.
Work brewer. Wow. You're totally immersed in the world of beer, which we're having a great conversation. We're going to continue in just a moment. But I do want to say that Adam is teaching a series of programs at the library this spring, starting tonight. At the North Spokane Library. You're also going to be at the Otis Orchards Library, Cheney Library, Deer Park, Moran Prairie, and Spokane Valley over the next several weeks.
Absolutely. So, doing the grand tour.
Yes, getting all over the county.
That's right.
And all these dates and times are in our latest program guide, Engage Magazine. You can pick them up free at the library or find us online at scld.org, and you can find out about these classes and more at all 11 libraries in the Spokane County Library District. So back to the science and history of craft beer. We were just talking about, during the break, about prohibition and having a negative effect on the economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's very interesting. So you mentioned a documentary called Beer Saved the
How
World.
Beer Saved the World. And there's been a lot of texts also written about sort of the importance of beer and how it's tied to how even human civilization developed. And it might seem glib at first, but when you really start doing the research, beer and food and other aspects of our culture are really important for how we developed and how we sort of designed our cities and all sorts of things. So, I don't want to underestimate the value of beer.
Wow. Never again. That's great. So I'm going to go back to some more basic questions.
Sure.
Now, an IPA.
Yes.
What is an IPA?
An IPA is the most commercially sold style of beer within the United States, and it has been the king of beers for quite some time, for probably the last 2 decades.
Okay.
An IPA stands for India Pale Ale, and actually the style kind of originated around the 1700s. The story that some historians balk at maybe perhaps being a little stylized is the fact that beer started to be shipped from Europe and England to India through ships, and they found that in order to preserve the beer and keep it fresh longer for the long voyage, they would load it with more hops. As I mentioned before, hops have a natural antibacterial element, so they were an anti-spoilage ingredient along with flavor. So the hoppier beer sort of developed as a style more or less to help preserve the beer, but when it arrived, it was more hoppy and more hop forward than beers had been traditionally before, and so it sort of gained its own following. And drinkers started to enjoy the higher bitterness and the more hop flavor than what they had seen before. And now in the United States, there was a period of time in the late 90s and early 2000s where there was sort of the bitterness wars of how bitter can we make a beer before it's undrinkable. We've sort of met a balance now, and I think a lot of sort of modern IPAs you're seeing now are much more about the hop flavor and less about bitterness. They're really starting to try and extract these really unique flavors and aromas you can get from hops that range anywhere from fruits like watermelon, peach, apricot, all the way to things like floral notes or spices. The compounds within hops can add flavors and aromas that you wouldn't think were in just a little green flower.
Oh my gosh, fascinating. So tell me, what's a day like when you go to work to your job to be a brewer? What's the day like in the life of a brewer?
Ultimately, you are a caretaker. You are the caretaker for the beer, and a lot of times I have to bow to all the other elements within the process. I'm there just to ensure that the beer makes it from one point to the other safely and becomes the product that we like. Like I mentioned before, the yeast do all the work, really. So on a typical day, you would start your your brew very early in the morning. You're doing that mash process. You're using the equipment to move the water and the wort from one vessel to another. Wow. You're adding the hops, and you're just getting that beer through the process and into that tank. And then you're adding your little friends, the yeast, and more or less then you're waiting. You're brewing other beer or just keeping an eye on it, keeping track, doing lab work or quality control work until that beer is ready, and then you move it along to the next step of the process.
And do you know it's ready by a timing method, or are you tasting it, or how do you know?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
There's definitely tasting along the way, quality control, just to make sure that everything is consistent and it's coming out the way you want. And then we have actually a way of measuring the residual sugars in the beer. So we know if there's little sugars left, the yeast have done their job. They've eaten their fill. And when it gets to the level of sugars that we expect, then we know that the yeast are done with their work and it's time to move the beer somewhere else. So
to the next step.
Yeah, we monitor the yeast's progress through that process.
And how large of a batch
Sure.
do you make at a time?
Yeah, breweries around the area and all across the United States definitely vary from size. It can be anywhere from 1 barrel, which is roughly 60 U.S. gallons, so very small system in terms of, all the way up to, there are some breweries that are brewing 100 barrels at a time per day. Okay. So at Iron Goat Brewing, we have it's roughly an 8-barrel system, and so we're pumping out typically when we fill one of our fermentation tanks, it's holding somewhere between 3 and 4 of those 8-barrel batches. So we're brewing somewhere between 24 and 30 barrels at a time for a particular beer. And
those are the 60-gallon barrels.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So if you do the math, it's a lot of gallons.
Yeah.
And you'd be surprised at how quickly that goes when folks are thirsty. So.
Oh, I bet. So I'd love to come watch this sometimes. So then once it's all ready and everything, and then you have to bottle it or can it or how do you, what is that process?
Sure, yeah. There's different avenues for packaging, for sure. A lot of breweries will put at least some of their beer in kegs to be served in draft, either in tap rooms or bars all across the country.
Okay.
Then, of course, there is other methods of packaging, putting it in bottles or cans. Typically, that part of the process is all the same up until whatever vessel you want to put the beer in. Typically, you chill the beer, you get it cold, it conditions as cold. The cold and time allow gravity to all the things that you necessarily don't want in the beer settle out to the bottom. Residual yeast and maybe some other compounds that are going to add some odd flavors, they all drop out. And during that cold time, a lot of breweries will force carbonate the beer. You add gas under pressure and it dissolves the bubbles into the beer, which makes it fizzy and carbonated, like we know. And then you put it into the whatever vessel you're packaging it and seal it up and send it off to be consumed.
Send it off then. Yeah. So where's your beer? How far does it get sent out?
Sure. So in the state of Washington, we are all over the eastern side of the state, and we are actually in most of the Seattle area as well, Iron Goat Brewing.
Really?
And then there's different laws for each state. So if breweries want to sort of distribute outside of their own state, they have to go through a few more hoops and get a few more distributor companies involved to sort of get their beer outside of the state where it's brewed.
Gotcha. So if I could enjoy Iron Goat beer here in Spokane, I might not be able to in Coeur d'Alene?
You won't be able to find it in Coeur d'Alene.
Okay, that explains quite a bit. I had traveled last year and had tried some local beers in areas and was hoping I could find those beers when I return home, and have been disappointed. Now you've explained why.
And that's why the local push is really a big key part of craft beer, because the beer that you're drinking in your neighborhood pub, people might not be able to try on the other side of the country.
Somewhere else. Yeah. So then do you have kegs that go out to different establishments in the area?
We do, yeah.
And is there salespeople involved? I mean, this is a whole industry and company.
It is. And it becomes very expansive. Absolutely. You have sales teams, you have distributors who are basically the middle person. They are in charge of taking the beer from the brewer and getting it to the person who serves it. And it becomes a very vast web of individuals who are working within the industry.
Do you know off the top of the head how many people Iron Goat Brewing employs?
Between I can give a good guess. Between our brewery and our kitchen, I would say it's somewhere around 25 to 30 employees, including our sales team and ownership. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah. Unfortunately, we were starting to run out of time, but I do want to emphasize again the science and history of craft beer, programs at the Spokane County Library District, starting at North Spokane Library tonight and various places around the county. So go online, scld.org, to see the times and dates, or pick up our Engage magazine again. And Adam, wow. And this is only half of your life, because you have a whole other job teaching film at Eastern Washington University. So you're a very busy guy, and I am thrilled that you could join us today.
I was happy to be here.
I'm next time, though, you have to bring samples.
I will do that. I promise.
That's great. Okay, so don't miss this class. This has been a fascinating discussion. I mean, science is involved and beer is involved, and it's the best of all worlds. So science and history of craft beer. Thank you, Adam, for being here.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you next time on Library Out Loud.
Library Out Loud is produced in Spokane, Washington by SpokaneTalksOnline.com, which is solely responsible for its content. Ask a question, recommend a guest, and hear this program again online anytime at SpokaneTalksOnline.com. Library Out Loud is brought to you by the Spokane County Library District and STCU. Go visit and explore your local library today.